Director of the MA Library Information Studies at UCL. My name is Charlie Inskip, and I was delighted the other day to hear from Jane Daniels, Chair of the CRG, that she was looking for a space to hold this event, because we've got space. The exams are on, so people aren't using these rooms so much as usual. So we were able to step in and offer that support to this event. It's been so well organised, using Terry's holiday time to come. And so it's been a working holiday for Terry, but we're really grateful that Jane has organised this. Terry's come along, and we've been able to put our logo on there somewhere. Just, we're happy. We're still teaching cataloguing as a core module since 100 years. Centenary is next year, so if you came to UCL, we'll be in touch with you, not asking for money, but asking for your memories. That's sometime in the next 365 days. So do reply to those spammy-looking emails if you get them. Okay, thanks very much. That's enough of me. So Jane Daniels. Housekeeping. If there's a fire, run behind me through those doors, which are marked fire door. There is also a fire exit at the rear of the building. Follow the green lit sign with a person with a white arrow. That is also the way to the toilets, which are where you came back in, just by the swing doors, by the decorating. We have got the decorators in, sorry about that, but we've got to do it sometime. Thank you very much. On to Jen.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. It's a marvellous opportunity for all of us in the room today, and a great honour to have Terry with us today. He is using his holiday time to put this event on for us, and I think that's amazing. I'm not sure I would be that dedicated, but Terry obviously is. At the risk of embarrassing you, I'd just like to say a few words.
Okay.
They will be nice words, obviously. So, Terry is currently Head of Digital Initiatives and Infrastructure Support at the Ohio State University Libraries. He presents on and teaches discovery, digital preservation and library metadata, including data mining and analysis, data reconciliation and data transformation, and has received universal praise as the creator of MarkEdit. This free software has revolutionised the way that metadata is created, shared, enriched and maintained around the world. Now, I'm going to read this bit out. I'm not sure. I was a bit amazed at this, but it says on your web pages, so if this is wrong, it's down to what you put on it. Terry's dedication ensures that MarkEdit continuously evolves. And reading Terry's information on the web, I saw a figure of 800 plus hours?
For this last update, yes.
During 2017-18, spent on developing MarkEdit 7.
Yep.
There you are. But most importantly as well, I think, Terry is also the recipient of the 2019 Margaret Mann Citation, awarded by the ALCTS Cataloguing and Metadata Management section, which is our sort of sister group in the United States. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to quote from the citation.
Okay.
So it reads thus: Terry's outstanding professional achievements in cataloguing have had a lasting and positive impact on our national and international professional community. His most notable and well-known achievement, leading the creation, development and ongoing work of MarkEdit, cannot be understated. MarkEdit is an invaluable tool used by a host of libraries and librarians, ranging from small public libraries to large academic research libraries. The development of MarkEdit has had a tremendous impact on bridging traditional and future cataloguing practices such as MARC, XML, crosswalks and linked data. So I think that really sums up your amazing contribution to our profession, and to particularly the technical strands of the profession, which is going through such an amazing evolution and will continue to do so. So now what I'm going to do is just put the next slide up, which shows the programme. There may be a little bit of jiggling around with this. We'll see how it all works out. Excellent. So this is the programme that we have planned for you. So Terry is going to kick off by telling us about his amazing software and the latest developments in that. We then have a scheduled audience question time, which is your opportunity to ask Terry questions. We'll have a break between 3 and 3:30, and I'd just like to say thank you very much to OCLC for sponsoring the refreshments today. It's fantastic. And then Terry will finish off by gazing into the future for us. The question and answer session, I'm going to hand over to the SIG Vice Chair, Paul Shackleton, because his technical knowledge far above mine. So in case you ask really technical questions, I'd like to have someone really technical that would be able to put those to Terry and facilitate the discussions. So without further ado, can we please welcome Terry.
Yeah. All right. There it is, hot dog. So this has been a bit of a holiday for us. I've had my family. It's the first time my kids have been out of the United States. My oldest graduated this year, so he's the one in the glasses over there, the shortest, other than my wife now. He's going to University of Cincinnati as an architect. That's what he's interested in. So we thought we would take a trip outside of the outside with him. So what I plan on doing, I set my alarm because if anybody's ever heard me talk, I can just talk. It's one of the things that happens when you become a faculty member. I joke that I get paid by the word when I write or when I speak, and so I'm going to try and keep a thing on it. And one thing that actually nobody knows about, except for a handful of people, I found out about this on the 1st of June, so a couple of days ago. I'm actually a full professor now. So that was, very pleased with that. So now I don't have to do anything. No, I'm kidding. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a little bit of history about MarkEdit, and then I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that's new in MarkEdit 7, and kind of what's going to happen probably over this summer, assuming that all the time that I have planned kind of works itself out. And then we'll answer questions. So let's start here. So anyways, a little bit about MarkEdit. So it's been 20 years. It's actually the 20th year of working on MarkEdit. I started it in 1999-ish as an undergraduate at the University of Oregon. It was actually developed originally as a set of coding tools and then pulled together into multiple languages. First public release was around 2000-ish, I think. And that was really because a colleague at Oregon State University, where I was working at the time, said that I should make it available. I had no intention of ever making this public to anybody. It was really a tool for me to work with. When I was a student, I was working in the map library at the University of Oregon, and we were told we couldn't catalog maps because we were in a separate library, but the individual who was the head of the map library, who went on to work at the Library of Congress, wanted to. And so I wrote this as a way for us to quietly catalog maps and sneak things into the database without anybody knowing. When I got to Oregon State, we found out we could use it for other things. And so that was kind of how it got started. It's evolved quite a bit. So the first version, if you started using it in 2000-ish, it looked something like this. It's basically 3 windows. There was a breaker, a maker, and always the text box for making changes to stuff. Looks a lot different now, so this is the current version. As of today, at 20 years, this is the 7.0 version, and that's the 3.0 version on the Mac side. There's almost functionally paired together. A few things missing on the Mac side that I'm trying to finish sorting out. Some of those have to do with some me learning some stuff in terms of how Apple likes you to do certain things. MarkEdit's really a big application, and the way that the menuing works within the Apple thing is all quirky. Today it's used all around the world. This is my last year. Every one of those dots represents a country. There's roughly about 20,000 active Windows users. I measure that by when I put an update out, how quickly they get downloaded. There's about 1,000 active Mac users, about 150 Linux users. I imagine those users are kind of use it the same way I do, which is as a headless command line tool, essentially to integrate into scripts and things that we work with. So when I work with MarkEdit, there are 3 rules that I follow, and to be honest, to some degree, these rules are actually part of the reason why MarkEdit's never made it into the open source world, partly because of the kind of questions. Let me put it this way. I tried it. There was a test there was a test a number of years ago. I did a process, kind of where I worked with a small group to see what it would look like to move MarkEdit into an open source space. And the problem that I ran into had to do with number 2. That MarkEdit's mark agnostic. So I live in a world where I work with a lot of Research 1 institutions. They're in North America primarily, and they want to tie everything to Mark 21. They want everything to work really closely with Mark 21, and it makes the cataloging tools very Anglo-centric. MarkEdit, roughly about a third of the user community doesn't live within Europe or the United States, Canada, which means that the tool has to be able to be used by folks who use languages that are outside of English or Latin-based languages. Also has to be able to be used in flavors of Mark that aren't Mark 21. So there are roughly about 50 flavors of Mark out there. It has to work with all of them. And so because of that, I have essentially created a set of rules that force MarkEdit to do certain things. And so so that's one of the rules that I followed. Because it was such a catastrophe at the time when I tried it, it stayed closed. Whether or not it opens in the future, I've been thinking about it again. Every couple of years, I sit down with groups to try and figure out what the long-term planning is for the application. I've always had a plan for succession. And in fact, right now, because the application is so large, that plan is actually looking quite different this time around as I talk to a few larger organizations potentially about putting MarkEdit in trust if there was ever a time where I was ready to transition off of working on it. The other 2 rules, MarkEdit's a real-world tool. There is a research version of MarkEdit that you can't see. It's actually in the application. It's just stuff that doesn't work or works half the time that I embed and make available as they show up. And then MarkEdit works as a part of a much larger library metadata infrastructure. So you'll see a lot of the work that went into MarkEdit 7. The work that I'm doing now is really around thinking about how MarkEdit integrates with other things that we work with in our environment. You can download it here. That stuff is all important. All right, so highlights. What are some of the things that went into MarkEdit 7 that took a lot of time to work on? Well, I added lightweight clustering into the application. So one of the things that a lot of folks have been spending a lot of time looking at is how you use OpenRefine to work with library metadata. There's a challenge, though, in terms of getting data from Mark into OpenRefine and OpenRefine back to Mark. And so I worked on 2 workflows within MarkEdit. One that would allow you to move data from Mark into an OpenRefine metadata model that then could be edited in OpenRefine and brought back into MarkEdit without having to futz around with scripts. But another one was just actually create a lightweight clustering tool into the application using a couple of different matching algorithms that could be used to reconcile people, places, dates, whatever it was you were looking for. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like. We can look at actually how it works if you're interested. I had no demos planned along the way. A new way to process XML and JSON data. So one of the things that MarkEdit's done for a really long time is support XML crosswalks. One of the things I found is that tends to be a barrier for a lot of librarians. In some institutions, you have someone who has the expertise who can actually take and write a crosswalk for you. That's not always the case, especially in smaller institutions, but honestly, even in some of the larger R1s. So what I ended up doing was, in this version of MarkEdit, I developed a tool that allows you to actually work with XML and JSON like a delimited file, and actually just load an example of what that file would look like and create a map of how to create a crosswalk without actually having to know how to translate that data. We'll take a look at what that looks like. There's a new linked data engine. So one of the things I've been working on for the last 3 years is thinking about how libraries can start to transition from a world where Mark lives within a set of strings into a world where data can be embedded and semantic concepts can live within the Mark data. A lot of those concepts are making it into the conversations we're having around the linked data and the PCC groups around integrating semantic web data into mark records. The tool here supports the reconciliation process of looking up a variety of national libraries and reconciling data and putting those into your MARC records so that it can be used elsewhere. New task processing. So task processing now works in a way that I never imagined that it would for automation. Consolidating Z39 out of 50, most people didn't know it, but there were actually 6 or 7 different clients in the tool, and so every time somebody would tell me they have a problem with one, I had to figure out which one they were having a problem with because none of them worked the same. Editing functions, lots of new editing functions, integrated help, and then something that very few people actually know what it is, but I use it all the time locally, and that's this folder watching functionality, which allows me to essentially set MarcEdit to watch folders or FTP directories and download records and process them automatically through tasks or what have you, and allow my catalogers to never have to touch them until the end. So in well-designed workflows, this actually may be a process that could be a time saver. So I will walk through what those look like. If you've used MarcEdit 7, you have seen Hazel. Hazel is my dog. She is my helpful, sometimes helpful, installer agent. So one of the things that I ran into when I started working on MarcEdit, and one of the feedback that I got as I went through the application is MarcEdit sometimes is hard for new users to use. You install the program, it pops up a box that says set some preferences. You have no idea what preferences you're supposed to set. If you just say okay, that's great, but it means that MarcEdit is going to make a whole lot of assumptions in terms of what your metadata looks like. And if those assumptions are wrong, you're going to get data that doesn't look quite like what you want it to look like. So I wanted to make it kind of fun, and I didn't want to make it like Clippy because I don't want anybody to hate my dog. And so what I tried to do was come up with an installer agent that kind of walked you through the process of answering the questions that were important through the installation of MarcEdit 7, or if you were installing MarcEdit 7 and had 6, helping you through the process of migrating data that you had in your older version into the new one. So what can you use MarcEdit for? I think you guys already know this, but just really quickly, automating vendor records, facilitating large data cleanups. Folks ask me what's the largest data set I've ever worked with. It's roughly about 60 million records at one time. But in terms of like record size, there isn't a top-level record size. I could easily turn over anything that I have space for. Converting ACR2 data to RDA data. Converting Dublin Core, different XML formats, reconciling data to linked data, validating records, splitting, joining, merging, character encodings. I imagine this might actually be more important here than maybe in the United States, although for some of our large research ones like Ohio State, character encodings and transitioning data from one character set to another is a constant issue that we run into. Resolving inconsistencies through clustering, integration with OCLC or other ILS systems, merging data between sets, or retrieving data through Z50 OAI or a variety of other protocols. And these are some examples of some of the things that I work with and work with other people on in terms of how to process. If you're starting and trying to get started, there are places where you can go to get information, tutorials, a sample data lesson plan that I'm working on right now that has sample data as well as a walkthrough of how all the how different parts of the functionality work. I think I'm about 4 or 5 steps through it. It's kind of being built around kind of some of the, I think they're called the Library Academy structure, and so that way it'll be familiar for folks. It'll be on GitHub because I have a couple of folks in ILS schools that would like to be able to borrow some of the parts. And then there's workshop-y stuff. Let's see here. And if you're in MarcEdit, you need to get help. So this is new in MarcEdit 7 and 3. There's this place over in the right where if you just start typing, it's going to help find you answers. It's natural language. MarcEdit uses a Levenshtein distance algorithm to take the information that you're typing and try and find the function or the thing that you're looking for. So just, I'm going to pop this open so that I can see it here. It takes a second because this is my development machine. So over here in the right, if you find that in MarcEdit 7 you've lost something because I moved everything around, if you'd like to know how to find something or you want to know how to work with something, you can just start typing what it is you're looking for. So let's say I wanted to do delimited text. So that will get me to the delimited text translator. If I wanted to export, there's the export. So you can just start typing and it'll start filling things in. It's also a place where if you're feeling interested and have nothing better to do, there are actually Easter eggs built into the program. I occasionally, when I'm working on presentations, need to pick me up. And so there's a picture of cats and books. There's a variety of those things. If you know how to look, it'll play cataloging music for you, what I like to listen to when I'm working on stuff sometimes. There are little bits and pieces in there. In fact, if you can find it, there's an asteroids game built into the program because sometimes I'm bored and I need I need a game to play. So, all right. So MarkEdit 7. So one of the things I spent a lot of time working on, I just like to wanted to point this out. So I actually spent some time with a researcher at Ohio State who does work with dyslexic students, specifically thinking about how accessibility works within the application. So we work with a lot of librarians who had let me know during the process that the application was difficult for them to work with. They were using it for a long period of time. And so I started thinking about how to interact with the application for folks who had sighted issues, who had challenges related to dyslexia, also just folks who wanted to be able to have more freedom to adjust the way that the application looked and felt. And so the application now has in it a section called Ease of Use. And in this space you can create themes. So there's a light, dark theme like most people are used to. But you can actually create a theme to change the colors of just about anything within the application. Create your own. There are places so you can figure out where to set fonts because that's constantly a question, where do I find these fonts? If you don't have a Unicode font on your machine and Microsoft is taking them away, this will actually help you find where you can get one that's free. It's a big font, but it covers most languages that are available, including old languages. It's the Google No2 fonts. You can set it up to remove font styles. So one of the things that I learned, particularly from working with folks who had sighted issues, were bold and italics made the screens difficult to read. And so this will actually remove all the styling, so that way it's easier for folks to work with. There's other feedback options like providing feedback with sound, setting transparency on windows, and also everywhere within the application there are now text-based tags that can be read by either screen readers, or you can actually turn it on so those text-based tags will show up if you want to have those there. They're not on by default, but you can turn them on. And so it was really kind of an effort to think about how the application can be used and be maybe a little bit easier for people who have to use it for long periods of time. One of the other benefits of doing this is MarkEdit became a little more international. So the application, I use a process that does machine-based translation, and I work with some folks who also help with fixing those because the machine-based translations sometimes are hilarious. But there's roughly about 28 languages it's been translated into, and everywhere where those languages have been translated, those tags get replaced with the languages that are there. So rather than it being English language accessibility tags, it's the tags that the language are there. You can also search the help in those language-based using the language that you're working with and find them within the knowledge base. So there's really some thought put into trying to make this easier for folks to work with it, at least as easy as possible. And I'm actually working with a couple of folks in the library usability space that are specifically focused in their research on disability studies, particularly within their focus primarily is with students, but thinking about how the application might be able to be more friendly for folks. I mentioned that. So the other thing with MarkEdit 7, it's a little easier to install. So I'll mention this because it took a lot of time to figure out how to make it work. So one of the things that I run into all the time, and I'm not sure if it's like this here, but in the United States, our IT folks like to lock down machines. I'm not sure if you guys have to deal with that. Now, I actually run the IT unit at the library, so I'm responsible for locking down the machines there. But I do run into folks who have a really difficult time getting their IT folks to let them manage their own software or to install MarkEdit the way that it's been updated. Since I don't update it on a regular basis, that's sometimes problematic. So the program now has two different versions that you can download. They work exactly the same. Just one requires you to be administrator and one doesn't. So the same way that with Google, you can download Google Chrome and run it whether you're an admin or not, MarkEdit can do the same thing. You can install it as a non-administrator user. It sandboxes the application just into your user space and allows you to work with the program exactly like as if you downloaded it as an administrator. And you can manage it, update it, and do whatever you need to on your own. And so that was something that I wanted to spend. I spent a lot of time trying to sort out and work with my IT staff as well as folks at NYU and down in the California schools who do actually manage our systems across and would prefer not to have these non-administrator downloads. Ways to be able to identify them so that there aren't problems if they're managing the software and a user installs them. So that was something that's put a lot of work into this time around. So this is my installer. So you can see Hazel, who's going to walk yourself through the setup. They're roughly about, I mentioned that I did this time, you'll notice language. If you the program recognizes the language of your computer, it'll set the language and retranslate everything. If you say let's get started, it walks you through I think 7 screens which help you pick out your fonts, your what version of Mark you're using, whether or not you want to enforce character encodings, blah blah blah. And she gets different pictures along the way as she tries to help you through the process. All right, and that's the language preferences, as I mentioned. This is a problem, but I want to talk about other stuff. All right, so big focus in MarkEdit 7 was trying to improve automation, task processing especially. So when I first started working on MarkEdit 7, I had some folks at some large national libraries ask me if I was going to fix the way that tasks work. I had no idea what they meant because in my local use of tasks it worked just fine. My assumption was when I first put MarkEdit's task-based stuff together, and I have to admit, the way that MarkEdit's automation stuff works actually is probably the biggest failure in the application. I've, for 20 years, trying to figure out how to make the program, how to set up an automated process that catalogers could use, that they wouldn't essentially make me use for them. When I first started doing MarkEdit, because it was a set of programming tools, I assumed that if I created a scripting wizard, basically it's a tool that lets you pick stuff and then generates either a Visual Basic or a Python or a ProScript, that everybody would want to learn how to program. And nobody ever wanted to learn how to program. I used it more than anybody else in terms of creating scripts for people. The next thing I tried was because folks use Connection if they work with OCLC. Most of my peers in North America work with OCLC. They use Connection or Passport, so they're used to writing macros in that language. So I figured, all right, well, I'll embed a macro language into MarkEdit. I hate OML because it's so restrictive. I'll just put the whole, Visual Basic framework in. That'll be great. Nobody used it again. I was the only one writing these for people. People would say, how do you do this? I have to write them. So what I ended up asking the community was, how do you want this? What would you like? And most people told me they wanted a macro recorder. I had to tell them, well, OCLC doesn't even write their own macro recorder. They license it for somebody else. I wasn't going to license one, and I really didn't want to write one. But what I could do was come up with something that was kind of a hybrid process. And that's essentially what the task process was designed to do. When MarkEdit was first put together in 6.0, when the task process was set up, it worked a little bit like this. So a user would create their tasks, and essentially to create a task, you set up a new task, you tell it what action you want to complete, it opens up the box, you enter in some information, it saves it. And so behind the scenes what was actually happening was the user would start it, it would kind of parse the task, and then behind it, it would open windows that you couldn't see and load and reload the file and type things. It was essentially like a keystroke processor, and it worked. GUI clicks, worked just fine. It worked great if your tasks were roughly about 10 to 15, which is what I figured most people would use for best practices. Where it broke down, and I didn't realize anybody was doing this, but OCLC was doing this, as well as a couple of large national libraries and a few folks who I work with who work at some larger institutions. They were creating tasks that were over 1,000 items. And that's just crazy. The program wasn't designed to do that. I couldn't even imagine. And what was funny was I had asked somebody, because they told me the tasks were broken. And I asked them to explain to me what that meant. They were working on a set of files. There were 300,000 records. Their task was over 1,200 items, and it would take 15 hours to complete. And I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds broken. That wasn't how I intended it to work. That sounded broken. So what I ended up doing was I spent a lot of time rebuilding how the tasks work. And so what that meant was actually pulling all of the code that works with the MarkEdit processing engine into a separate broker. And this broker essentially evaluates the task and decides what elements need to be run and what elements don't against an individual record, and then it processes each record in real time. And it does all of the operations that need to be done. So the process now where it kicks off the process, it feeds it into this broker, which evaluates both the size of the record set that it's going to process and the size of the task file it has to work with. And then it makes some assumptions based on how to do it, which is going to be the fastest. In the examples that I ran into for folks who are working with things, so say for example the 300,000 and the 1,200 task process, we could cut that down on this laptop to taking about 10 minutes. So it was a significant change in the amount of time it took to process the data because the processing now wasn't this GUI-based process, it was really more of an intelligent-based task process that happened. Now I do recognize sometimes the broker doesn't make the right assumptions. And so within the task-based processing tool, you can actually override the broker's decision and say I want to use the more legacy process and have it fall back into that set. But by and large, this is how that ended up working. It made a significant change to how the tasks work. In addition to changing the way tasks work, I changed the way that tasks are organized. Within MarkEdit 7. The other thing I hadn't realized is that folks were creating hundreds of tasks. I just, again, didn't even think about people creating that many, partly because I'm not a cataloger anymore. I'm not cataloging on a regular basis. And so inside of the task-based tool, we introduced groups. So the ability to be able to create groups within the application. And the other thing was the ability to be able to create reusable task lists very easily. So if I have, that's too small. So if I have this task here, and I want to reuse a section of it, I know I'm going to use it more than once. It used to be that it was very difficult to take something that existed and move it into another location. You can now just select the parts that you want and create a new task group. And that will create a shared library of all of this that I can add into other places. So I can do that now very quickly. The other thing that I ended up doing with the task that wasn't done previously, and it solved a problem with difficult to write regular expressions, is I started to add programming into tasks. So you'll find that there are script actions, so control flow. So the ability to be able to run tasks within a loop or within a results loop. And so what this ends up happening is a lot of times on the list you'll have somebody say, I have this field, let's say I need to break it up into its own field. So a good example is, I don't know if folks here use Content DM. I've got something like Content DM. I've exported the data. All of my subjects are on one line. There's semicolons between the groups. I need to create new fields at the semicolon breaks. There is a regular expression you can use that will loop through over and over again. But it's really difficult to write, and sometimes it doesn't work super well. You can use now a results loop to do that. Essentially, rather than knowing how often it needs to do this, you just tell it to run until results are equal to 0. And it will keep running the same process, cutting off the last field over and over and over again until it finishes the process, which makes it really handy. And so the results loop can either be greater than, equal to, or less than a value. The counter loop is greater than, less than, or equal to a value. So that way you can do those things. One of the things that's, that I have in the version of MarkEdit that I'm getting ready to, that's being tested right now and getting ready to release, is the ability to add if-then loops into the control flow. So that way you can actually have the application do evaluations against the records before it even runs the operations inside the task. So it creates a secondary level of control flows. And this is kind of one of those places that I'm putting more work into, thinking about how to improve the ability for folks to automate these kind of processes. And in doing that, one of the other things that I spent some time working on is if you create a task, these tasks can be run from the command line. So before, MarkEdit never really could do that well. Any task that I create, I can embed into a command line structure. So I can run that on a Linux box, I can run it on a Mac box, I can run it in my Windows-based box, and integrate it into scripts, bash scripts, pro scripts, whatever you're happen to be working with, and not actually have to go through the interface of the application. So it gives you some additional ways to think about how to automate the tool. Second, I want to make sure I know where I'm at. All right. So the other thing I worked on this time around for automation is thinking about how can I make it so that places where I don't necessarily need user interaction or cataloger interaction to work through a best process, a best practice that we know works well, how can we make this more automated? And so the use case that this really was set to fulfill was we get a lot of vendor records. We have a set of best practices. We have tasks that we run on each one of these vendor records. In a lot of cases, we have records that we get from vendors that we're really confident in. And when we run the task, they're done, we load them. And so we usually have a two-step process where somebody who's not the cataloger will get the records from the place, will put them somewhere and produce some initial processing. That records will then be transferred to a cataloger who will look at them and do the QC work on them and make sure that they're finished before they go forward. This means either getting records that are downloaded from email or more likely pulling them from FTP, SFTP sources. So the idea behind this was, could we take one of those steps away? Do we really need to have the person have to go download those records and do the manual step of running a particular set of tasks? And the answer is you can actually automate a lot of that work. So in this process for the watch folders, I've created essentially a Windows service. So I haven't figured out how to make this work on a Mac yet, partly because I haven't figured out how to make a service start on a Mac yet. Still working on that. But on the Windows side, when you install MarkEdit, there is essentially in the settings a configuration option. Let me show you where this lives. Called Configure Watcher, that allows you to set a continuous monitoring service. So either schedule that processes once a day or once every X number of minutes within a 24-hour minute period. And you can add, delete, edit watchers. And so when you enable the watcher service, it turns on a version of MarkEdit that's running in the background, that's essentially counting down the time or watching the time to figure out when it needs to run. When it runs, it can do certain things. So in this case, this is an example of MarkEdit. It's going out to Eastview, which is an FTP folder. It's pattern matching. So rather than taking every file name, it's pattern matching based on a set of a pattern that's only taking the MRC files that are in that folder. It's going to output the results of my work into this folder here. And it's going to run this task list, and it's going to join all the records together at the end. So what I end up getting is, when you go to Eastman right now, on a monthly basis, I get back a selection of, I think it's about, we usually see about 8 to 10 files. The tool now is set up so that it just goes out and collects them. So when Eastman posts the records, it pulls those 8 to 10 files down, runs them through the task, joins them all together into a single file, dumps them into a place where then the cataloger can go and see that the records are finished and do whatever else they want to do with them. So we eliminate a step. And it's a step then that happens automatically. So we also have watch folders that are just generic. So these are just generic watch folders. It's a vendor folder. You just throw the files into that folder, and whatever file goes into that folder will run these tasks. And it's set up to watch match all the files, but I could set up patterns. So if I wanted to separate them by vendor, I could do that. We don't just have a big vendor. For the example here, I just have a big vendor file. And so it processes the data and then outputs it into a location. The way MarkEdit handles so that it doesn't trip up and do multiple records, it keeps track of what the history is of when the last file processed, what was its name, what did it look like, basically creates a hash. So that way it doesn't reprocess the same file. If you want to get rid of it, you can go into the original matching folder and delete the essentially cache part of the folder set, and then I'll let you run it again. The actions right now that are currently being supported, it will join files as the first step or the last step. It can do MarkXML to Mark processing, and that was specifically designed to support a couple of vendors who like to give us MarkXML files instead of Mark files. And I need to be able to translate those before anybody can actually do stuff with them. And then tasks. Longer term, because as we're using this, we're filling out kind of what are the things that we're running into that we're not finding in this program. I need to, we'll eventually include the ability to be able to do character encodings on the fly, because we have a set of vendor records that come in one character encoding and need to be translated to Unicode. As well as the ability to be able to choose translations, because right now we have a set of data that comes in JSON files, and I'd like to be able to process the JSON data as well. And so I gave you this idea of what the watch folders look like. One of the other things I worked on in MarkEdit 7, and it's one of the parts that's been the most complicated, has been dealing with UTF-8 data. So MarkEdit internally only works with data essentially in Unicode. It translates data in Unicode if it can determine what the character encoding is. If it can't, then it works with it in straight binary. The problem that I started running into this year actually was OCLC that caused this problem. They didn't cause the problem. What they did was they exacerbated the problem for many organizations. Within the United States and folks who use Mark 21, we're required to use the decomposition, it's the compatibility decomposition. It's the KD notation of UTF-8. It allows us to take diacritics and basically make them go from Unicode to Mark 8, Mark 8 back to Unicode. And so a E with a diacritic over it is going to look like an E with a diacritic, whether it's in Unicode or not. It's 2 code bytes. Obviously, there's a canonical version of that represents a single code point that folks would like to use. And if you're using your operating system to type that data, when you type it, it's going to use the canonical byte. It just always will. That's the way that it works. OCLC used to enforce certain kinds of normalizations because they only allowed you to put things that were in the Mark 8 repertoire into WorldCap. This year, when they changed that, they allowed any Unicode data to go in, which meant that people now were putting in either different or mixed encodings, normalizations. And what we found out right away is there are a number of ILS vendors who definitely expect one encoding. And so while the data looks perfectly fine in MarkEdit, looks perfectly fine in Notepad, when you load it into your ILS, you see a letter and a diacritic because they don't come together. Or you see broken data. So in MarkEdit, what I ended up trying to do is to address this problem by allowing you to essentially determine not only the normalization that you were going to be looking to use, but that you could enforce that normalization across the application. So every time the application touches your records, it will ensure that that Unicode data is enforced within that normalization. And then because Mark 21 uses these crazy 880 fields, and a separate option that basically tells you to ignore that, what I just told you, because that data seems to be weird in the way that it gets used. Because apparently this data should never be, it always should be canonical, especially Asian-based languages that don't look right if you turn them into KD notation. And so this allows folks to essentially forget that the data that they get may not be in a normalization that they want to use, and be able to work with it. The other thing this solves, and this was a really interesting problem because it was some folks in Canada that ran into it where they used both French and English, is that if you use a file of mixed normalizations, and I'm searching for an E with an accent mark that's canonical, and I have non-canonical data in my file, I can't find them because MarkEdit uses a ordinal-based approach to finding data, so it's binary. It's looking for the data a certain type of bytes. It won't find the difference between the normalizations. By using this enforced normalization, it will fix that. So it'll actually find data, and even with an accent mark, whether it's normalized or not, which helps address that problem. Clustering support in MarkEdit. I'm going to go through this because we're going to eat into your question time. MarkEdit, folks have in the past wanted to do lots of different things here. In MarkEdit 7, I included an OpenRefine tool. So this tool allows you to export and import into and out of OpenRefine. It creates a specific data model that replicates to some degree the mnemonic format in OpenRefine with a record and field identifier, so it's really easy to be able to tell which fields belong to which record, which is really useful for MarkEdit in the second step when it tries to re-import the data back into Mark format, which is what's useful. However, if you don't need all of the stuff that OpenRefine requires, MarkEdit has a clustering tool. And so this clustering tool will allow you to define fields, so a range of fields, a set of fields, whatever, and decide to cluster them together and how you want those clusters displayed, and then be able to either find and extract records based on the clustered data or actually edit the records based on the clustered data. So that way you could say reconcile names. So this is actually what we used it for. I had a use case and needed to reconcile some names. I didn't have time to do it myself. I wanted to be able to push this out on other people who didn't know how to use OpenRefine, so we created a tool that would allow them to work within an application that they're familiar with. And then that kind of led to questions of, can I extract records based on clusters, or can I do other things? And so that was kind of how the tool continues to expand. This tool works both with Mark data as well as Excel data. So if you get data from a vendor that's in Excel or in a delimited format, you can use the tool here to also structure your data and do clustering and edit the data in real time. Clustering algorithms, those things, Lewiston distance, there's a composite. I prefer the Lewiston distance algorithm for what I'm working with usually. And this is an example of what you get back. So here's an example of a set of records. It spits out the different types of sets. I can basically select the records that I want to update, add the data that I'm going to replace it with, and then basically process as many records as I want, and when I'm finished, process all the changes and do them all at once instead of having to do one at a time. The last thing I'm going to mention, then I'm going to answer questions with you guys, is this XML JSON profiler. So this was an idea, again, to kind of get me out of the bottleneck. So MarkEdit's always been designed to have the ability to do XML transformations. The problem that I run into now more than I think in the past is I see a lot more non-standardized XML formats that vendors are providing. They're using their own internal-based structures rather than providing MarkXML or something else. And those kind of one-offs are really difficult to work with, essentially. The other thing is I'm seeing more vendors provide JSON records. And for a lot of librarians, XML is sometimes a stretch. JSON tends to be a stopper when it comes to being able to reuse the data. And so the tool here was really designed as a way to allow users to take a file that they've been given, have the tool help you map that data into a Mark record, and then be able to reuse it over and over again. And I'm going to just show you just very quickly what that looks like, because it's one of those things that I've been getting slowly people to work with. An example of where this gets used in my organization, because I was running into a problem with this. Let me see if I've got this handy. Yeah, so here we go. So we work with Past Perfect. We're one of the largest institutions that I'm aware of that works with Past Perfect for museum-based data. Come on, open that up. It's probably trying to open it. Oh, oxygen. This is just going to take a second. All right, so oxygen. All right, so we get these files. This is in Past Perfect. It's not in a there you go. It's not in a library language. It's in their structure, their data structure, and the data structure looks the same regardless of what data you put into it. So the tags may not actually correspond to what data goes into those data sets. It really depends on locally how the individual is set up, the data choices that they made going into it. We have a lot of these records that we want to be able to search within our discovery tool. And our discovery tool that we've been creating uses our own metadata framework. It's basically an amalgamation of some things that we needed that provide semantic web concepts, a way for us to pull all the data together and work with it. But nobody really wanted to work with this, honestly. And so what we wanted to do was translate it into Mark, because even though the data wasn't good, we could spit it through another process that did a lot of the stuff that we needed to do with it. And there were more people in our library than that could work with it, honestly, as it went through the process. But in order for us to work with this, I was responsible for writing the XSLTs, because I'm the one who has the expertise to do that. I have multiple collections. They all look different, so I can't reuse them, that use this exact same format. So I have to work with the curator to understand what every one of these fields means. The option was to actually give the curators a tool to be able to do that themselves to some degree, where they could work with a cataloger. Because we have special collections catalogers who work with curators all the time, and they have a better idea of kind of how they match the data that goes into these records with what would translate into Mark. And so inside of the tool, I included a wizard that allows them to download the file that they're going to work with, because I need an example. And then what I'm going to save it as, and whether it's going to be Mark XML, or something else. And then what it does is it parses the data. So now I just tell MarkEdit which of these is the record. What's the record in this file? Because I don't know. So it just samples the set. So this is the record data. And then it flattens it into the delimited text translator. So now I have something that all of our catalogers are used to using, because they use this to translate Excel data into Mark. And so now they can go through and select fields. So title field is going to map to we'll just throw a couple zeros here. Stop with that. Okay, so we create our mapping of what we have here. We go to our next step, and it saves a profile that you can use within the application, either in the normal tool here, right here, or in the batch processing tool, or in the command line tools. Creates a profile that can be reused, that now I can point to that Past Perfect file, or whatever the file is I'm working with, Past Perfect, JSON, whatever it is, and use that profile to translate that data into Mark. So then I can actually work with it. More of my catalogers can work with it in a way that they couldn't before. And that doesn't require you have to know. It doesn't require you knowing how to create a XSLT, or understand how to process the JSON objects or what have you. The tool creates a process that facilitates that for you. All right, so what's my future work? And then I'm going to let you guys talk. So there's a couple things I'm working on right now. One of the things that I can't stand is I use oxygen all the time. It's an overkill for a lot of the stuff I'm working with. I'm actually putting a lightweight XML editor into MarkEdit. It's actually there, you just can't see it. I would have used it here, but it's not finished, and there's a few things that are broken. But what this is allowing me to do is think about what kind of tools I need on a regular basis to be able to work with it, and what are kind of the crosswalky tools that fit within the kind of Mark domain of editing data into potentially an XML editor. So that's something that will happen sooner rather than later. It'll come onto the Windows side first, the Mac side second. There's some things I have to work out on the Mac side, especially since Apple just released a new version of their stuff in the development package. There's some UI changes I need to adjust. I'm working on an individual record editor. MarkEdit used to have one. The tool's always been designed around batch editing, but I'm having more and more users that are using it to create individual records. This also helps me start thinking about what MarkEdit looks like in an environment where you potentially use it to create bid frame-like records. I'm going to admit I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like at the end. I'm not convinced it's going to look like what it looks like now. But I do think there's enough there to be able to create profiling work that maybe is flexible enough to be able to demonstrate an individual record editor flexible enough to work with lots of different formats. I've done one before that I wasn't particularly happy with and took away back in the 5.x version of MarkEdit. I'm trying to see if this version will look a little better. And I think that this time around there are more users that are doing individual record edits that maybe they'll actually use it and I'll get more feedback. I'm working on expanding the XML JSON wizard, especially on the JSON side. The JSON stuff needs to be fairly flat. The hierarchies confuse the heck out of the wizard. The XML stuff is easier to process hierarchically and be able to process it correctly. The JSON stuff, the way that JSON structure can cause significant issues with the wizard. So I'm working on ways to be able to address that. And then also working on updating tutorials and documentation. A lot of the documentation gets updated as needed. I'm trying to go back through and update it so that folks who are especially new, given the number of changes in MarkEdit 7, will be able to make the transition a lot easier. Excuse me. All right. So that's what I have to talk about. And I just ate a little bit into the time that you guys had for questions. So.
Thank you. I think I have applause. Right, thank you. Yeah, my name is Paul Shackleton. I work for OCLC. I think it's fair to say that I probably wouldn't be doing my job with Metadata if it wasn't for MarkEdit. MarkEdit got me sort of into the world of doing stuff with data, starting off with databases and SQL and stuff like that. I had a debate with Jane as to how to actually organise this day, and I said, well, what we really need is people actually asking their own questions, because tutorial information is out there. Terry's got a YouTube channel, and there are many videos out there that you can follow on YouTube, and you can get the basic idea and get going on that. But I'm sure a lot of you here use MarkEdit, and you've probably got stuck on things that are not necessarily obvious. I'm not saying it's hard to use, but you know,
it is in places.
It does very difficult, complicated things in places, and I think sometimes you have to sort of make that intellectual leap, and we can solve those questions here. And I think also, there are wider questions about integration, things like that. So I have lots of questions just in case you're all shy, but I don't think you will be. So if you just want to put up your hand and speak as loudly as you can, and we'll get going.
A very basic one.
Yes.
Start with a simple. Once the MRK format, the mnemonic format, is there any specification for it or any documentation which I'm struggling to find at the moment?
There was at one point. Let me see if I still have it online.
And is it a proprietary? Do you know if any other system or application is using it?
So the MRK format was actually designed specifically because the Library of Congress was using it. So prior to MarkEdit in 1999, there was an older program called MarkBreaker, written by the network and whatever their group is. It was a DOS-based program that they used to do the translation, and they used the mnemonic format as their way of doing it. In fact, the same codes work that worked in the older version. I'm not sure if they still have that up. I used to keep a website. I used to keep in my knowledge base. Let me see if it's here.
Well, I can email you.
Okay, yeah, I can let you know.
If you find something.
Yeah, it's.
Is it a proprietary, or is there anything else?
It's not a.
And you using it.
It's not a proprietary format. Anybody could use it. Like I said, it came from the Library of Congress. It was really just an easy way to work with it. Let me see if this is. But I do know of a number of, I don't know, I'll have to look for it. I do know there are a number of places that do use it, but they tend to be smaller. So I work with a lot of folks that create catalogs for small publics to like churches or people who are doing like small book catalogs. And rather than having to create their own MARC processing engines, they'll point people to MarkEdit, and they'll output their data in the mnemonic format, so that way they can ingest back and forth. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, I will tell you that MarkEdit uses that, so you can see it, but internally it does not use that format. The program actually uses a different format, especially in MarkEdit 7, and it's for speed. It normalizes the data down into a format that's more friendly for binary UTF-8 data. So.
Any more questions?
I just kind of like use. I feel more under-expressed in the service of MarkEdit, and so it's kind of like mostly kind of human-based, slightly beyond that kind of stuff. So I've been doing it for a couple of tasks recently. One of them was I wanted like to create like a list of all the OCLC's versions of all the headings. And what I ended up doing was kind of like copying the title at the end of all the other headings and then deleting everything that was an order heading and exporting it. I was just trying to look at it, and it was like, we had loads of files of this. And is there a quick way of doing this that I'm missing?
So maybe. There's a couple of different ways of outputting different kinds of reports within MarkEdit, so you can get different kinds of data. If you were, for example, wanting to isolate a very specific set of data based on presence or lack of or certain kinds of information, the tool has this thing called extract selected records, which would allow you to select a display field and use that to extract a specific set of information. The tool also has a reporting tool, so it can create reports based on material type or other things, but it has a custom reporting tool which allows you to search for things by regular expression, to create reports by record, so by specific control fields, or custom formatted records that allow you to output data basically any way that you wanted to. So you can use this to create like call numbers or things like that. So, and based on different elements that you use, regular expressions determine which data to capture and which data not.
So you only send out that data from each record?
Yes. And that's fairly new in MarkEdit. It's in the reports, custom reports field. So if you can't figure it out, just give me an example of what you're looking for. Shoot me an email and I'll help walk you through it.
Well, actually, that's going to be one of my questions. Have you got any data that you could demonstrate how custom reports work? I keep on sort of tripping over it. I've not yet got around to figuring out.
I don't have one handy. The reason I wrote it was specifically for trying to sort out. We have an old dot matrix printer, and we're trying to get rid of it, and I needed a different way to create call numbers, and so that was really the start of how to do it. But what ends up happening is I end up getting a lot of people who tell me what they want to be able to create delimited outputs, but they need them to look a certain way, and they only want to select certain data, and so this was really a way to create essentially structures. So from here I can create a format, an output format, that allows me to set the defined fields and put as many lines as I need to and structure them in any way that I want them to. And I have the ability to put tabs in and things like that. There are examples here that show, in theory, how it should work. What I should probably do is put a data file with it so you can actually see how it works. Like this is a barcode example that I have, somebody who was looking to output barcode data. And so I have this sample record and this output, which allows me to take the data from the 001 and structure it as the barcode format they were using. So in this case, it would look like that. And so it was really kind of to meet that kind of special need. And so I did try and throw a couple of examples, but I could probably do a lot better. Some better examples up there. I thought about recording something so it'd be a little easier to watch it, because I know it's easier sometimes than just reading and having a record there.
I've realised I'm probably not on the most recent version of MarkEdit, so I'm sorry if you've already fixed this. When I'm exporting tabs or limited records, to create a report for someone, often I'll want a column that's really just the main entry. And I don't seem to find a way to get sort of all the fields that begin and end. So you have to one thing and then 11 is 30.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I'm pretty sure, and I will confirm this. Make sure. So within MarkEdit, one of the things that I spent some time doing in MarkEdit 7 was allowing you to use the same type of format you can use in the add delete field, the XX format, in different places. So in all of the editing formats, like in edit subfield, edit field, rather than having defined fields, you could say like 1XX. So in assuming that I've done that, I've written it down, so if I haven't, I will do it when I get home. I can find the stupid thing. What should be able to be done is, just grab a record here. And this is, if you haven't used MarkEdit in a while, so there are now 3 delimiters. The idea behind these is there are contextual delimiters. So if you say, for example, export a call number, it used to be if you said like I wanted an 090 A, B, and C, it would separate them into different columns. But if you had multiple call numbers, you couldn't tell contextually which values match together. If you ask to use the contextual delimiter, it'll actually put those together. So you see them together rather than seeing them separately. But you should be able to just use 1XX, not ZZ, 1XX, and that should be able to capture anything in your record that's a 1XX or 24X or something like that. I'll make sure that's right. It's almost true everywhere. I've been going through the application and adding that functionality so that you can use that same structure.
I've noticed in the tools, some of the tools like you can just use your regex dots instead, so you just put 1 dot dot.
That works too. I actually have used so XX is traditionally what I see and most catalogers are familiar with, and so I support that. But you can usually also use asterisks or dots in most places. If it's not specifically a regular expression. If it's a regular expression, you got to follow regular expression rules.
Can you use regex range in the same context as square brackets?
In some functions you can, in other functions you can't. They have to be ones where you can define that you're using a regular expression. If you have a place where you can say you can use a regular expression, then you can use the brackets to work with it. In that case, it's all about context. So when people ask me sometimes, I'm doing a global edit, and I want to use a regular expression, part of what I ask is what they're trying to do, because each one of these functions exposes to the regular expression engine a different amount of data. And that's partly done for simplicity, so you don't have to account for all of it. But it means that, say, if I needed access to the entire field, it's going to either be this function or the replace function. If I need just the subfield codes, then and I need access to all of them, the edit field gives me access to all of them. If I need just the subfield data, the code to the end of the subfield. So it creates a scope around what the regular expression can see.
Yeah. I've not catalogued for a while. I've not been cataloguing, so this question may be a bit out of date. I seem to remember when I was working with MarkEdit, I was struggling to work out what the syntax for the regular expressions was exactly.
Yeah.
Finding it in one place, and there's some things I have to work out. I'm just wondering if you have that in some kind of like definitive syntax that you use.
Yeah, so it used to be if you were using MarkEdit when it was older, it was a regular expression language that I wrote myself that tried to create something very Perl-like. Because MarkEdit's written in C#, it uses the regular expression language. And so you can use any of the language elements here to work with the tool. And in fact, there's a I don't have it handy with me. There's actually an online tool when I teach folks how to use regular expressions that I point people to, because it does a pretty good job of allowing you to copy a record and see exactly what's going to happen before you run it in MarkEdit, because it's a .NET expression engine. But yeah, it's the .NET syntax. It looks a lot like Perl, but not exactly. There are some places where it just doesn't work. And then there are a few extensions to the language. So, for example, it's really difficult in this language to say lowercase things. So inside of MarkEdit, there's an L case and a U case function. So you can upper and lowercase data inside a regular expression group. There are mnemonics to be able to print the current date in different formats, to output the file name, to in your, say like in a task, have it prompt the user for information, so you could actually change the data every time the task is run.
There's back references as well.
There are actually, yes. Inside of the regular expression language here, there are grouping, constructs, qualifiers, and back references, as well as alternatives. So you can use these inside of the regular expression language.
I seem to remember, like, there was a wildcard thing I think I was struggling with, but it seems to be the same as something.
Yeah, so here your wildcards are going to be the asterisks, question marks. They're pretty general.
So, okay.
Sorry.
No,
Can I ask a general question about UTF-8 character set? You mentioned that Microsoft has taken away some of the fonts in Microsoft use of UTF-8 compliant, and that most of Microsoft applications are not UTF-8 compliant. Why is the default character set for Microsoft applications not UTF-8?
So what Microsoft does is they use UTF-16, which is actually what most people use. UTF-8 is actually not used outside of outside of libraries. UTF-8 isn't used all that often. It's partly because there's a disagreement in terms of how UTF-8 files get structured at the beginning. So in the Windows world, we use a byte order marker, which can't be used in the library. What's that?
That's what a bomb is.
Yeah, the bomb.
I always wondered what bombs are.
Yeah, so you outside of the Windows world, that actually doesn't get used. And so in the library world, especially if you have records that are generated using some tools, they'll generate that byte order marker and invalidate your record set because those 3 characters can't be there. The majority of the world, though, actually uses UTF-16 or UTF-32, which is a 2-byte structure, so there's a null byte put into between those rather than a traditional UTF-8. So, in fact, there's a lot of Microsoft's tools that won't even save UTF-8. So, like Excel just got the functionality to do it. It drives me crazy. And so in MarkEdit, because of that, so like let's say you're working with an Excel sheet, when you check that it's a UTF-8 file, it's actually evaluating what kind. Is it UTF-8, 16, or 32, and then translating the data for you. The other thing that you're seeing what Microsoft is doing is rather than having a single font like the MS Arial Unicode font they used to distribute, they would license that. They've created their own language packs, which is how they're addressing the UTF-8 code points as individual packages rather than as a single file. That's problematic in libraries where we might see lots of different languages, and sometimes languages they don't have code packs for. So like I work with a group that works with the Cherokee language. I don't believe there's a code pack for it, but I can get it through the Google No2 fonts because there's a large, it covers, like I said, about 263, 270 languages. It covers roughly about 100,000 more characters than the Windows area Unicode font was. It's also about 1.5 gigs to download. But it's a really comprehensive font that I like to use for a lot of stuff.
In data, for data exchange, in the metadata generally, because I work in the repositories area now rather than traditional library cataloging, so Mark really doesn't figure. I mean, I use Mark a lot, so I'm familiar with it, but I'm basically converting data from XML to Mark all the time and backwards and forwards, and also supplying CSV files or Excel files to people who don't. And of course, the character encoding is a real issue because, well, XML is UTF-8.
The XML should be UTF-8.
We supply CSV files, which most people double-click and it opens with Excel. It immediately loses all your UTF-8 characters and it sets identifiers that might have preceding zeros to numbers, so you lose all that. So it's just a nightmare, really.
Yeah, no, it is. And in fact, Microsoft made it a little easier with 2019. It supports some of the things to make that easier. But the other problem you run in with Microsoft's Excel is it uses predictive typing. So those ISBNs will always not work right unless somebody goes through and manually sets the values, and nobody ever does. No, it actually is an interesting issue that we run into all the time with cataloging because we get data in so many different places. So XML is a really interesting one. So I see a lot of XML data that's not in UTF-8, which just drives me crazy. In fact, most of the EAD data that I see created isn't in UTF-8. And so one of the things MarkEdit does is it converts data to UTF-8 because I can't stand not working with data that comes from XML and other formats. But that requires then me having to hope that the XML engine is smart enough to help tell me, one, what the encoding is, two, the operating system understands it, and that I can make the transition that I need.
Yeah, it's fun, isn't it?
Yes.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I use MarkEdit a little and use the same few functions, and what I'm interested in doing is learning more of it, and I wondered if you recommend a route through, or if you have a guide just to sort of teach yourself.
Yeah, so two things. There are, and I'll send these slides so you guys can have them. A year ago, so it's slightly, where'd it go? Slightly out of date, but not too terribly out of date. Where'd it go? There it is. So I created a 101 series with the University of Illinois. They had the same question. There were a lot of folks at University in not just Illinois, but it was the Carlisle group. They had the same kind of thing. Most people use MarkEdit with a very specific set of functions, and they don't do other things until they run into it, and that's fine. And so what was done here was really a version of a series where we had a 5-part series where we worked through the different parts of MarkEdit that folks were particularly interested in learning. The other one that so that would be the 101 series. The other one that I would recommend, and this is something, like I said, I'm trying to finish, is a lesson plan here that has, here we go. It's scheduled to have 13 different topics. I've only done 3. Where the idea is to go through understanding what the settings are, working with your first records, vendor files sent me a record with errors, understanding what's in the Mark editor, automating edits, working with XML data, handling character encodings, linked data, clustering support, integration with your ILS, and using a structure that looks kind of like, pull this up real quick. Here we go. Working with a structure that kind of looks like this, where it breaks down kind of an overview of what you want to work on, walks you through the process, in places where I want to help a user understand and embed videos that walk you through a very specific small part of the application, and then take you through what's hopefully something that makes sense, and if necessary, link back to some data sets that I've created specifically for this, this workshop. The sample data sets. There are sample data sets in different XML formats, as well as data pulled from Harvard's bibliographic data set in a few places for examples. So this will also be a place where I'm working on trying to finish for folks that want to kind of learn more about how the program works in something that's kind of a little bit of a more informal kind of structure.
That sounds great.
Actually, I've just got a kind of follow-up question for that. I've written a bunch of questions here, and I've written sharing against a number of them. I often go away and try and figure out a problem that I need to solve in MarkEdit, and I'll do a bit of Googling and look at the list, and then get to the point of figuring it out. And I'm thinking, right, I've got a good example as to how to use this. I've got some data here, I can take some screenshots, and I'm thinking, I really want to put that somewhere so that everybody else can actually find it quickly in the future. Have you got any means by which we can sort of crowdsource your documentation? Help you?
So that is a great question, and this falls into another one of those areas where I did actually at one point have a wiki. Nobody contributed to it, so I shut it down. And so what I have now is for folks that are interested in contributing that kind of documentation. I have a few people that I allow to be editors, but if you have something you want to send, I can add myself or make you an editor. MarkEdit has on the web page the knowledge base, and so the knowledge base are basically WordPress pages that document how something's done. So here we have the custom report writer, delimited writer falls into the search. It's searchable inside of the help that's embedded into MarkEdit, so you can find it. And so this is the way that as I add new functionality, I add them into this place. I have one or two people who will do the same thing. They've asked to be able to contribute, so they will contribute occasionally to it. But yeah, that would be how I'm setting up sharing now. If I ever got a large enough group that was interested in doing it again, I would be willing to potentially pull out something into a wiki. I can actually set this up in a managed way so that users have, so I can set up as many users as I want and actually have somebody else manage that part of it if I wanted to. So there are options available. Just like I said, it was one of those things that everybody was super excited to try, and then just never happened. After about a year and a half of not having any stuff and having to maintain a separate wiki, I just killed it, migrated what I had into this space, and now it's part of the larger group. But that is a way to share stuff if you're interested. There are other places where you can share things. So inside the application, I don't find a lot of people who share, which is too bad. I've talked to a few folks who have used it locally for their own work. But MarkEdit has a regular expression store. It was designed with the idea that people would use it to share regular expressions. And so we have this concept of a local regular expression store where you can enter in information about how something works. So for example, here's a recursive regular expression example. I've jotted down an example. What are the applicable field functions where I find it? What's the expression look like? I can share that publicly. And so if I want to, I can search the public share and see what kind of expressions other people are sharing within the tool. So extract audio files. So this is an example somebody put in to extract an audio file, and I can pull that into my local instance. When I put this together, the idea was that people would share stuff into the space, and you would search and find things. What it's really ended up being used for probably more often in my experience has been, I've had a few people who have been in their positions for a very long time. They've created a large knowledge base of how they did their work, and they put it in this for the next person so that they knew how to do whatever it was they were working on. They didn't actually get shared into the larger space. So there are a few places in the application where I've embedded some of these kind of places for you to share stuff if you wanted to. But also you can manage them yourself in local. If you have local things, you want to manage them.
Hi. Excuse me, I'm just going to follow up on that one. I hate having to ask you for new things. I have done it once, and you did do it as well. But what I would quite like to see is when I'm putting together my regular expressions, obviously using the find tool and playing around with that, is I'd love on the search to be able to hit a button to say save my search, save my expression. And
Yeah.
from there I could then push it out to the task disk, or I can push it out to the store. That would be ideal. Because otherwise I'm copying and pasting into my own local notepad or whatever, and then it just sort of, I go back and find it again later, but it doesn't sort of get integrated into what I'm doing. Unless I turn it into a task, but then I have to do a manual paste over. So.
Yeah, I think I can do that.
Well, there you go. Cutting edge development. Most of us would have to ask a committee to think about it. So that's great. Any more questions? We got a couple more.
I got another specific task for me. I think actually, sorry, you can help me through things. Did you say about an extract tool before? Is that like a renamed version of the modified selected record?
So it's actually so the modify selected records works within the MarkEditor to extract records. The extract tool is actually a standalone tool that works slightly differently, but uses the same interface.
What I'm trying to do at the moment is, again, the DLC is a bit about trying to. I've just done a little fiddly way of copying and pasting to like kind of pull out where there's like we have like multiple like local bit numbers in the 907. Which only includes one master record. So I've got a master record DLC. Listed of like 3 or 4 bit numbers in some records. So I've been doing some fiddly thing with copying and pasting and using that as the search manufactured records. But is that would that extract record easily just like pull out anything like multiple records? Or what I really want to do is basically create fresh records for something other in that 907 field or some other field.
So,
Like that.
so you have. So I'm trying to.
4 entries in 907.
Okay, so you have 4 entries in 907, and what's the output that you're looking at?
I want one record per entry in 907, with each 907. So one per 907 basically.
Okay, so you have. So you would be creating new records out of those 907s, or you would be.
For each entry in 907, there's one 907, which is each of those 907.
Got it. So you actually want to break them down so that you basically duplicate the record for each 907. Yeah, got it. So there actually would be an interesting way to do that. I'd have to try it first. It's not going to be, so that would not do what you're looking for. It wouldn't, but what I would actually do, and this is why I'd want to try it first, because it gets a little terrifying, is MarkEdit has this use multi-line evaluation, which allows you to essentially capture an entire record. Sorry, it's a little bit small. Let me see if I can make this bigger for you. Let me change this real quick. Let me make the font bigger for you here so it's easier to see. 1 second. I like small fonts, so I sometimes have to remember to change them when I get done. There we go.
Is this the whole thing that we recorded on video, by the way? Is that right?
I don't think so.
Just audio. Just audio.
Yeah, just audio.
Just the audio.
All right, so you'll find it here. You'll find it here inside of the use regular expression, the multi-line. So what that allows you to do is actually capture the entire record in one bit and actually extract it as a group. So you could actually create a regular expression that found the 9xx field you were looking for, and the delimiter, and essentially output it multiple times, extracting out the individual bit that you were looking for. It's a little bit tricky, but it would be a regular expression you could write. So if you showed it to me, I could probably help walk you through the process. But that would be actually how I would do it based on what you're asking for, because you're going to need to duplicate the data. So you need a regular expression to capture the whole record, And then essentially there would be an internal regular expression that I would use named groups for, so that I could know which part of the record I was pulling out and reprinting.
Yeah, you might as well just do that because mine is doing this multiple times.
Yeah.
Other than regular task based things. So, yeah. Okay.
Any more questions? Okay.
This is going to sound a little bit cheap, but we use it, we use MarkEdit and MarkEdit, but you kind of mentioned you times CSV files. I still don't think I made that out of the file, theoretically, I use MarkEdit to import CSV files.
Yes. Yeah, so MarkEdit has what's called the delimited text translator. And, oops, I pushed the wrong button. And so essentially what this does, this allows you to either point to a CSV file, so you have the delimiter you can select, either tab, CSV, or whatever. You can actually point it just to an Excel file if you have an Excel file, either the binary or the XML format. And you can then map the individual cells to the marked field that they attach to. You can join fields together, so let's say a last name and a first name are in separate columns. You can join those together so they stay in one field, in one subfield like they're supposed to. So you have quite a bit of functionality. You can add constant data to records through this process. And then you can save it as a template. So the next time you need to do it, you don't have to recreate that. You just load it and run it again. And there's a file in the configuration settings. So MarkEdit has an option that will allow you to auto-calculate the skip digit in the titles. There's a basic file that has essentially a set of skip digits. But if you're using foreign titles, you can add to it, and you just have that used as part of the process.
I can ask the last question because I think it's going to be useful for all of you. Okay, so scenario, you're working away, you're making change, you're beginning to save. And you make another change and then you save. And you realise that last change you made is bad. I know MarkEdit does a lot of caching. Is there any way that you can go back to those cached versions to actually retrieve the last good version? Do you have to go and start from the beginning again?
That is a great question. And the answer to that question is you can actually wind back changes. If you finish with a process, if you go to package files for debugging, MarkEdit will pull together all of the cache files for a session. This was actually developed specifically for me so that I could, if you ran into a problem and you needed to be able to report a bug, it's hard for me if you just say X happened because I have to be able to recreate it in order to figure out what happened. And so a lot of times what I would ask people to do is send me examples of files, and then I would try and walk through all the steps. Depending on how often they saved or what they did during the time, something may have happened in one of those steps. The easiest way for me to track that is to use this, because what it'll do is MarkEdit creates and really doesn't delete old files until it absolutely has to. And it actually caches most data for about 2 days on run. And so if you use package files for debugging, it'll actually create the package of your session, which is zipped. If you needed to go back, you could package them up, open them up, and then look at the data that was put in there, and you would probably be able to find it. Otherwise, there's not a generic way to go back and look at the cache data, partially because I just don't really think about folks needing to be able to go back and do that. But that would be a way that you could do it. If you knew where, if you needed to find it, though, there's these application shortcuts. The temporary data path will take you to where MarkEdit stores all of its cache data when you're working on them. You most likely will be able to just say, show me the last date modified, and whatever one was the, whatever's the file, type, whatever's the one that's first, it's probably the last one. It's probably going to be somewhere in that list if that was what you were working on.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Right, well, round of applause for Terry. And, Jane, can you remind me how